Tilda, I recently had a joy, of course that's how it worked moment not all that long ago, and I thought I'd share it with you today because, well, it's quite an interesting one. So I was off exploring the country, as you do, and I visited an old manor house out in basically the middle of nowhere. And this large manor, obviously with its many acres of land around it, as these things are wont to have, had within its grounds a small farm area, mostly used for agricultural students and veterinary students to get used to dealing with all manner of farm animals, but there was an area of that farm which was open to the public. So you can spend a small amount of money to get in, help maintain the manor and all of that good stuff, and in exchange you get to wander around and gawk at a load of animals. And some of the paddocks, as they do, have little plaques on them that give you a bit of information about what that animal is, what breed it is, anything special or interesting about it. And I had my little joy, obviously, moment when I came to the pen which contained the Shetland ponies. Now, for those who don't know, Shetland ponies are basically a miniature horse, and they have a bit of a past when it came to the mining industry here in the UK. Obviously, their small stature and general sturdiness made them quite suitable for pulling heavy loads underground in confined spaces. But there was one particular sentence on that plaque that stood out to me, and it was the part which mentioned how ponies were brought into the pits in order to replace the labour of women and children when they were banned from working in coal mines. Now, when you say it like that, it seems completely blindingly obvious that that was the case. But as I do, when I returned home, I did a little bit of reading up on the history of the Mines and Collieries Act and things like that, and the history of both pit ponies and women when it came to mining in the UK. And I uncovered some pretty interesting stuff. And as I was reading through all of this, I was just struck by how I could see that feminists would look at this and do the oppression, patriarchy, women was treated like chattel, and all of that stuff. And yet, the actual reason for removing women from mining work was not in any way like that. It is in fact another case of the double-edged sword of freedom versus protection. So let's have a little look-see at it, shall we? Women working in mines in the UK was not actually that uncommon. Many were employed in above-ground roles, doing things like sorting ore, dressing it, cleaning it, shipping it, and handling more of the above-ground movement. But that was by no means where women's involvement in mining ended. There were absolutely women working down in the depths of the mines alongside male miners. And also, of course, children, at the time. And the women who worked underground in these pits seem to have largely been employed as hurriers or thrusters, and much as their names imply, they were there to hurry and thrust the wagons from the depths to the surface, by pushing or pulling respectively. And the pulling part of this operation was accomplished with a body harness and a length of chain attaching it to the wagon. And the shafts which would lead these wagons up to the surface were often not actually tall enough for an adult to stand upright in, so you'd often have to go about pulling yourself up on your hands and knees. And of course, since it was too expensive to light the entirety of the tunnel, the hurrier, which was the person at the front, would often just be given a candle that they were expected to hold out in front of them while they pulled however many 100 kilos behind them. It was filthy, cramped, physically exhausting work, and, perhaps most unsurprisingly of all, incredibly hot and sweaty. And of all the things to be the tipping point of this story, those last two things were the ones that did it. Hard demanding physical labour in those sorts of confined quarters, in some cases with relatively little ventilation, would of course make miners incredibly hot. So it wasn't actually that uncommon for the male miners to strip off when they were working, in some cases working completely nude, because it was just the easiest way of staying cool underground while doing that sort of work. And perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, this was a practice that the women working underground also engaged in, because it was just too damn hot to wear the full-length dresses that women were socially expected to wear at the time, and all of the accompanying underlayers as well. And because of the dangers with a lot of whirring gears and mechanisms and all that sort of stuff as well, it also became a little bit impractical for women to wear full-length skirts all the time. Just looking down the death records of some of the women who worked in the mines, the number of times that clothing, dresses, and skirts are mentioned as being caught up in cogs leading to death and general maiming is really rather staggering. So it should perhaps come as no particular surprise to anyone that when working down in the depths of the mines, away from the prying eyes of the supervisors, they would just wear trousers instead. So this is the Victorian era, and we've got a bunch of women basically slaving away underground, bare-breasted and wearing trousers. Well, you can guess how well that went down. Enter Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, a noted politician, philanthropist, and social reformer. He actually did a lot of very good work through his life. He was instrumental in reforms to the lunacy laws in the UK, which basically ensured that people with mental illnesses in the UK, rather than being confined to asylums and treated worse than livestock animals, actually had to receive at least some degree of treatment and dignity. For instance, they would no longer be kept in one large hall with straw covering the floor and left to just sleep and defecate wherever they happened to do so, nor would they then be hosed down with ice-cold water and not even provided soap with which to clean themselves, and they would no longer have to share a single towel amongst several hundred patients. Yes, that is actually how one insane asylum in London, specifically in Bethnal Green, called the White House, actually treated its inmates. And Lord Ashley Cooper helped to put a stop to that. He also did a lot of work regarding child labour laws and factory working reform, helping to pass Acts of Parliament that ensured no child over the age of 8 years old could be employed in the cotton or wool industry, that no person under the age of 13 could be made to work more than 10 hours a day, or 8 hours on Saturday, and he was a very strong supporter of prohibiting the employment of boys as chimney sweeps. So he did a lot of very good work to protect children from unfair and in some cases fatal working conditions. And it was this general attitude of his that led him to coal mines. At the time, he was looking to improve the working conditions for children in the mines, and to expose exploitative and abusive employment of children. In 1838, in a colliery near Barnsley, there was a horrendous accident following a thunderstorm, where a river broke its banks and flooded a part of the mine, drowning 26 children. And via Lord Ashley Cooper, this came to the attention of Queen Victoria. In 1840, Lord Ashley headed a royal commission that was aimed at investigating the condition of workers, but especially children, in coal mines. And as a result of this, 2 years later, in 1842, the Morning Chronicle and the Times newspapers began publishing stories not about the conditions that the children were working in, but the conditions that the women were working in the mines. And they really hammered home this point about women wearing trousers and going around bare-breasted, and the fact that they were being harnessed up like animals to drag these enormous wagons full of coal out of the mines. Never mind the fact that men were doing this as well, it was a problem because women were doing it. And this whole affair turned into a rather big PR stunt. The papers, and Lord Ashley himself, really tried to sell this angle of these women are working naked and in trousers, and that's not a thing that women should be doing. Lord Ashley even went so far as to say that this made girls unsuitable for marriage and unfit to be mothers. And he and the press pushed this narrative even though, by his own commission's standards, they only found a single pit where females worked with bare tops. And that was the Hopwood pit at Barnsley, and it should also be noted that only 6 females actually worked at Hopwood. With the help of a couple of sensationalist reporters, Jellinger Simmons and Samuel Scriven, and the use of some creative and scandalous drawings which were not accurate representations of how mines were run, such as this one depicting a teenage boy and a teenage girl sitting crotch to crotch being pulled out of a mine shaft in a ridiculously unrealistic way, this left the story to catch the imagination of the public and of politicians. A story where good, honest women just trying to work and provide for their families were being corrupted by men working naked alongside them and pulling them into debauchery and degeneracy, and all manner of other behaviours which were beneath women, because of course, women are just too good for such treatment. Now, as it stands, I don't think that anyone should ever work in the conditions that the miners were working in those pits, or indeed anything even remotely close to it. But I just find it so very interesting that the angle used to improve the working conditions in the pits was basically full-on white knighterry. Men work in these conditions and cope with it by stripping off some of their clothing. This encourages the women who are working alongside them to do the same thing. This means that the men are ruining the women and making them unfit to be wives and mothers, so women need to leave that environment for their own good, because that sort of work is beneath women, and they shouldn't have to do it. Overall, of course, this strategy used by Lord Ashley and these reporters was, of course, successful. The appeal to general Victorian prudery worked brilliantly, and this led to the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, which prohibited all females and boys under the age of 10 from working underground. Of course, females could still be employed in above-ground roles, which was what they were mostly doing beforehand anyway. But then, of course, as a result, the labour force now lacking women and young boys, the kinds of people who would do the hurrying work and generally squeezing into the smaller places, needed to fill that void with something else. And what better than tiny horses? Stronger than women and children, less legal rights, and you don't have to pay them as much. So I just found all of that rather interesting. A society that supposedly hates women and has oppressed them at every chance that they've got, liberated women from the hardest of labour in coal mines, leaving it to men and horses, so that they could work surface jobs which, while still very hard and demanding, still carried fewer risks. Basically no chance of cave-in, suffocation, black lung, all that good stuff. And that is the double-edged sword of gynocentrism. With freedom and equality, you will be expected to take equal responsibility and work in society, or you demand that you don't have to take that responsibility, at which point it is necessary for you to have less of the rights, because these two things are, after all, inseparably connected. And that's what I learned by visiting a small farm at a country manor and staring at a horse.